Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, a show where we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. Today we're going to do something new in this channel. We're going to kick up our top 10 lists, and in this case we're going to be talking about the top 10 underplayed cards in white in Commander. We're going to be doing a video for each color, so stick around this week if those sound interesting to you. Now the way we're going to be doing this is listing 10 cards I feel that are not played enough in the format for how good they are. These have to be cards that are good in a variety of decks and nothing too niche. And the methodology is I'm going to be looking at cards that have a 3% or less play rate on EDH rec. So without further ado, let's get started with our top 10. And our first card is Lae'zel, Vlaakith's Champion. 2 colorless and 1 white for a 3/3 legendary. If you would put 1 or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control, or yourself, put that many +1 of each of those counters on that permanent or player instead, and it's only in 5,832 decks with a 3% play rate. That is very low for an effect that adds counters to your stuff. Those kind of effects are usually very highly valued, and white has a lot of counter synergy. Most white decks will have quite a few cards in them that deal with +1/+1 counters, and the body is quite good on this. It's a 3/3 for 3. You're not giving up anything there. It also works really well in experience decks because it lets you get an additional experience counter each time you meet the condition. This is a very good card, and it's very surprising to me that it isn't seeing more play. It's also very cheap at the moment because it's from Baldur's Gate, so if you're considering picking some of them up, I would definitely do that now. Next up we have Collective Effort. For 1 colorless and 2 white, a sorcery with Escalate. Tap an untapped creature you control. Choose 1 or more. Destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, destroy target enchantment, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. It's played in 5,370 decks on EDH rec with a 1% play rate. Again, this is very strange to me. I mean, this is a super versatile spell. There's almost always going to be something with power 4 or greater on the board that you can kill. There's almost always going to be an enchantment, and most white decks go wide, so you're going to be able to buff all of your board. And for only 3 mana, really, because once you tap the 2 creatures, which you'll certainly have lying around in white, then you're basically getting 3 very solid modes for 3 mana. 2 removal spells and a team buff. That's an absolute steal, and this should be in way more decks. Next up we have Runetail, Kitsune Ascendant. It's a 2 colorless, 1 white, 2/2 legendary. When you have 30 or more life, flip Runetail Kitsune Ascendant, and then once it's flipped, it's a legendary enchantment with prevent all damage that will be dealt to creatures you control. It's played in 4,820 decks for a 1% play rate. Well, we're in EDH, the format where we start with 40 life, and white is a color that's good at gaining life. So this basically reads, for 3 mana, an enchantment where all damage that would be dealt to your creatures is prevented. So this is a must kill. They absolutely have to have a kill spell for this, or they can never attack you, and basically they can never block you profitably. There's nothing they can really do. Blasphemous Act does nothing. All damage-based removal does nothing for your board. This is just very, very strong. And there's not really any need to build around it at all. You just have to have 30 or more life. So this card is absolutely amazing, and again, should be in way more decks. Next up, we have one of my favorite cards that I think is criminally underplayed. It's Wedding Announcement for 2 colorless and 1 white, an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. If you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card. Otherwise, create a 1/1 human creature token. And then once it has 3 invitation counters on it, transform it, and then it just becomes an anthem that gives all your creatures +1/+1. It is played in 4,311 decks, or 1%. This goes in basically every white deck that is even remotely aggro. So as long as you attack with 2 creatures, which is incredibly easy to do, you're drawing a card. In white, that can mean after 3 turns you've drawn 3 cards. For 3 mana, that would already be amazing. But then it flips, and you're also getting +1/+1 to your team. This is just really good. And even if you don't get to draw cards, even if you're just making tokens, which by the way then let you draw cards on subsequent turns, even if you just get 3/1/1 tokens and then an anthem for your team, that is still worth 3 mana. So this just seems really, really good. I'm still surprised by how cheap this card is and how few decks play it. You should definitely get copies of this while it's still relatively cheap, because it's really hard to reprint as well, seeing as it's in a wedding themed set and it's double-sided. Next up we have Scholarship Sponsor. For 3 colorless and 1 white, a creature human advisor, 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, each player who controls fewer lands than the player who controls the most searches their library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference, puts those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffles. It's in 4,589 decks, or 1%. This is a little bit dependent on your meta, but if your meta has any sort of green decks in it, which, let's be honest, most metas do, then this is going to be really, really good for you. You simply wait till those decks have more lands than you, and you can just be ramping by 3 or 4 cards sometimes. Yes, you're also letting some of your opponents ramp too, if they have fewer lands than the player that has the most, but making friends at the table is never a bad thing, and this is just so much value and such a good way to catch up against green decks. Next up we have Restoration Specialist for 1 colorless and 1 white. It's in 4,299 decks, or 1%, and it's a creature Dwarf Artificer, a 2/1. For 1 white, we can sacrifice Restoration Specialist, return up to 1 target artifact card and 1 target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. It's in 4,299 decks, or 1%. That is an awesome ability on a nice little creature that can be recurred by Revelark and Sun Titan. If your deck has a decent number of artifacts and enchantments, maybe I would say at least 7 of each is the point when this becomes good, but even if you're only returning 1 of the things, it's quite good. If you're returning both, you're getting some serious value out of this, and if you have ways to recur it with Revelark and Sun Titan or other cards, then this is really, really good. This should be played in a lot more decks. Next up we have Taj-Nar Swordsmith for 3 colorless and 1 white. It's a 2/3 creature, and when Taj-Nar Swordsmith enters the battlefield, you may pay X. If you do, search your library for an equipment card with mana cost X or less and put that card onto the battlefield. Then shuffle your library. This is in 3,015 decks and doesn't even reach 1% of decks. So this is really, really nice. You get to search up for an equipment and put it straight into play. Obviously something like Skull Clamp is fantastic, because at that point you're paying 5 mana, getting a 2/3 and the Skull Clamp into play. And then if you have any other mana lying around, you can just start putting it on your creatures and drawing cards. It works well with other more expensive equipments, but obviously the cheaper the equipment, the better. That being said, this is a really solid card, and cheap tutors that come with a body are at a premium in EDH, so I'm surprised to see it in such few decks. Next up we have Krovax Ascendant Hero. For 4 colorless, white, a legendary creature, Human Lord. It's a 4/4. Other white creatures get +1/+1, non-white creatures get -1/-1, and pay 2 life, return Krovax Ascendant Hero to its owner's hand. It's in 2,165 decks, or 0% of decks. Now this is really sweet. If it's your commander in a mono white deck, you're just getting +1/+1 to all your board, and any opponent's creatures that aren't the same color as yours are just going to get -1/-1. If your meta has a lot of white in it, it gets a little bit worse, of course, but this is kind of good against go wide strategies. It basically locks your opponents out of playing any non-white token strategy, so stuff like goblins and things like that are going to have a lot of trouble dealing with this, particularly since you can just pay 2 life and return it to hand, and then recast it again without command attacks. This survives any board wipe, any removal, and you don't even have to pay command tax for it. That is really solid. Even if it's not your commander, it's very difficult to kill. That ability is really strong. It's almost like half of an Elish Norn in the right deck and in the right situation that is harder to kill. So that just seems very good to me. Next up we have Vesperlark for 2 colorless and 1 white. It's a creature elemental with flying. It's a 2/1. When Vesperlark leaves the battlefield, return target creature card with power 1 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can evoke it for 1 colorless and 1 white. It's in 1,911 decks, or 0% of decks. Revelark is obviously a really great card in Commander, and this is supposed to be half of a Revelark in every sense. It's still a very good card, even though it's only half of what a Revelark does. Being able to bring back a bunch of utility creatures, such as, for example, Esper Sentinel, which is obviously the best target, but there's quite a few things that you can bring back, and if you have this in your deck, you can build around that. In a Soul Sisters deck, such as one with Darian as your commander, this is also really, really sweet. It can just bring back any of those cards. It's also a card that you don't necessarily need to evoke. You can just leave it in play. A 2/1 flying can be good for carrying swords or equipment, and then when it dies, you just get a little bit of value. This just seems really good, and I'm surprised that it's in so few decks. And finally, our number 1 most underplayed card in Commander is Aura Fracture, an enchantment for 2 colorless and 1 white, and it says sacrifice a land, destroy target enchantment. It's in 459 decks, or 0%. Now, this card is really, really good, and if you haven't played it, you maybe don't understand why. Some people who see this are very turned off by the fact that you need to sacrifice a land. Sacrificing lands is really bad, that is true. Late game though, when you have a bunch of lands, this just lets you deal with all those pesky enchantments, which are the hardest type to remove in Commander. And you can deal with them for no cost and repeatedly. So at instant speed, you just need to sacrifice a land, not pay anything, and you can deal with any enchantment on the table. So being able to turn your lands into removal spells for enchantments for free is just so powerful. And this card is really underplayed. It should be in many more decks than 459. Give it a try and you'll probably be pleasantly surprised. Okay, so that has been our top 10 list for today. Are there any cards that you think are criminally underplayed in white? Please let us know in the comments section below. I read and respond to all comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe. It really helps the channel because I'm trying to grow right now. And until next time, take care.